So I am Georgie Foster, and this is actually, it's an updated version of a previous video, just going through the steps to add a new record to the Hydroclimate2k database. Now, just briefly, if you don't already, it'll help to understand what exactly the database is. It's basically just a very highly curated collection of data sets in the LiPD format, where all of those data sets have passed our particular criteria for inclusion. And so to get the ball rolling right at the start of the project, we actually accumulated a whole lot of potential candidate data sets from existing LiPD databases, so databases in LiPD format, things like ISO2k, Coral Hydro 2k, Sisal, and we still need to check those records that they meet our specific criteria. Of course, not every Pages 2k database has the same criteria for inclusion, and also add in our specific metadata. But that's a separate video. This one is around adding new data sets that are not yet in LiPD format. And the LiPD file structure, it's really the crux of what makes our database work. So LiPD doesn't include, it's not just the actual data, which we would call variables. So that would be things like, it can be multiple variables per data set. It could be things like ostracod, delta 18, or concentration of some particular element, grain size, tree ring width, whatever. But also metadata that gets tagged on to all of those variables and then is machine readable. So collecting the data is quite easy. You'll just get the data from the CSV or NOAA file or whatever format the author made it available in, and then use an online tool to make a LiPD with that data. And then in our project folder, our project drive that we all work in, we have a specific tool which is called a QC sheet for sort of historical reasons, where you add in that metadata. It could equally be called a metadata sheet. Okay, so that's some background. And I'm just going to quickly step through. I'll dive straight into it. Okay, so when you think that you have found a potential new record to add, there are a series of steps that you need to take. Okay, so the very first one, actually, I'm just going to share my screen now. I wasn't going to, but I'll do this now. Let's see. Share screen. Okay, I'm just going to hide the meeting controls. Okay, so say you have trawled around the literature, you've done it, on Google Scholar or websites or whatever, or it's just one of your records that you know isn't part of the LiPDverse, and you have found a new record. So as I said through this, I work mainly in the lake team, so I'm going to use a lake. I'm also, this is what I would call one I've prepared earlier. Actually, all the information from this is already included in the QC sheet, but that's fine. I'm going to show you the steps I went through when I added this. So you would find your paper. So here we've got, this looks like a good candidate, some sediment, delta 18 and grain size data from Lake Elsinore. And even in the title, the authors have stated that this reflects droughts and pluvials. So it seems like a pretty good candidate for being a hydroclimate related record. Anyway, so the very first thing you'll want to do is to check, just double check that it isn't already in the database. And so here you see, hopefully you're familiar with this already, but I am in our project Google Drive. This is where we all work on compiling the Hydroclimate2 database, our Hydroclimate2k database. And so I'm going to go straight to the QC sheet, which is the metadata entry tool. And that's here in this folder called QC sheets. There's always the current, the QC sheet or the metadata sheet for the current version of the database will always be what you see when you come in here. And so the first thing you would do is to search to see if the data set is already here. Now, the best way to do that is the dataset name, because this is a very tightly controlled entity. And actually every single lipid file in the LiPDverse follows the same naming convention. So the lipid will actually be called this. This is the dataset name, and it is the way it goes. It's the site name and then a full stop, then the name of the first author and then a full stop, and then the year of publication. And there is no deviation from that, with no spaces. So you can see here we've got Alberta Lake with no space in between. And that's, okay, a little bit of deviation maybe. I think those are particular cores. Okay, so this particular one, it would be Elsinore or Lake Elsinore or Elsinore Lake, whatever, and then a dot, and then Kirby, and then a dot, and then 2019. And so you would check here. I've just done a Control F for Elsinore. Just thinking hard. Oh, yep. I mean, every time I do this search, it's going to come up because I know this record's already in the database. I helped put it there. But so you'll do that, and maybe when you're doing this, you'll find, okay, so the data set is not already in the database. Good. The next thing you want to do is to check if so say we didn't have a match here, but it's possible that the data from this paper could be in lipid format in the LiPDverse and just not showing up in our particular metadata entry sheet. And so the place to go to check for that is actually the second tab of this spreadsheet here, which is called Datasets in Compilation. And what this is just a list of every single dataset that exists in the LiPDverse. So it's not, there isn't a row for every variable of every data set. There's just one row for every data set. So here's the data set name, which is SiteName.Author.YYYY publication. You can ignore this one. And then this column in comp, short for in compilation, every data set that is showing up in our QC sheet, in our metadata entry sheet, will have true alongside it. And if it's not showing up, there will be false. So you can see here, for whatever reason, this particular data set is going to be somewhere in our QC sheet, but this one is not. So here again, we'll just do a quick Control F for Elsinore. Of course, there is... Okay, it's a bit complicated here, but there's two versions of this, and one is showing as true. This is the one I'm interested in, 2019. There's apparently another paper from Elsinore from 2010 that is false. That's fine. But just say it was this data set you're interested in assessing. To have all the variables from that data set appear on our QC sheet at the next update, you'd simply change this false flag to true here, and then in next time Nick updates the database, all of the variables from that data set would appear in the database. Okay, so we've done two things. We've checked in the QC sheet that our record isn't already there. We've checked that our data set isn't already in the LiPDverse and just not showing up in the QC sheet. The final thing you want to do is just to check that somebody in your particular archive team isn't already working on this. And each archive will have a different way, I think, of tracking this. We have one particular, I work largely in the Lake group, and we have a particular way of doing this, which I could recommend. But your archive leaders might have thought of another way to do this. But I'll go into the folder for the Lake team. So we have this thing called a workflow overview. This is an extremely handy sheet. It makes this very easy. And so every time someone starts working on a record, whether that was one inherited from an existing database or a brand new one that they're adding to the database, they'll add it as a new line to this workflow overview. So here you can see we've got the dataset names all formatted very nicely. So site name, author, and year. Then we can see the name of the person who's working on that particular record. And here in this case, we also have a little statement about what stage of the process this particular data set is up to. So again, you just want to do a quick Control F and check that somebody isn't already working on this. I mean, obviously we've got a successful hit here because I have already worked on this particular record. Okay, so you found a record and you've checked that it isn't already there somewhere and nobody else is working on it. Great. So the next thing to do is actually to jump straight into gathering up the data and the metadata. And so, well, actually, we'll get halfway there. The first thing you would want to do is to go through the paper and to check that the data you found does in fact meet our criteria for inclusion in the database. And so just as a reminder for where those are, so here I am in the top level of our project Google Drive, and we have this file here, criteria for dataset inclusion in the database. And so these lists the things that the dataset has to achieve to be included in the Hydroclimate2k database. And so the first one is that the authors have stated that the data is primarily, the proxy data is primarily driven by hydroclimate variability. Then we have a criterion for resolution, and then a criterion for the degree of chronological control. I won't read them out. You can have a look at them here. Okay. So that's something you'll need to be looking for. For that, you'll use the paper. I think that the best way to do this is, again, I'll show you the example in the Lake group. But for every folder, for every data set that we're assessing, we actually make it its own specific folder that is named exactly, again, according to the dataset name. And then inside that folder will be this notes file, again, always with that dataset name. It's just a really good identifier where you can make notes as you go, as you're reading through the paper, trying to figure out all the metadata. So this was the notes file I made for this person. Here's the paper. This is this particular paper. I'm just going to do a split screen. I find the easiest way to do this is to have the notes on one side and then the paper on another. And you just go through this and keep an eye out, firstly, for things that will show you that this data set has met the criteria for inclusion. So you can see here when I was going through that I must have found a statement in here somewhere that this, the delta 18 of the calcite here reflects delta 18 of lake water, which means it passes the hydroclimate criterion. Down here in the methods, there's a bit of information about the age control and the sample resolution, and those things showed me that this record did indeed pass all the necessary criteria to be included in our database. So while we're here, this is how I do my metadata collection, how I suggest you do it too. Just sort of doing a skim through the paper and keeping an eye out for all of the phrases that are necessary to fill in all the metadata fields. So you'll become familiar with these as you go along. There's Elsinore. So there's sort of quite straightforward things that are highlighted in green. There's site level data. That's things like the latitude and the longitude, the name of the site, various things. Then we have the variable name, which here, for example, highlighted, we've got the delta 18, calcite, blah, blah, blah. And then we have the sort of what I call the interpretation metadata, the real meat of our database. Well, maybe not meat, I'm vegan. The real tofu of our database. Right, and so this is the stuff you want to keep an eye out for. So the environment interpretation and the supporting information about that, with the direction, the seasonality, any of that, if they're secondary or even tertiary interpretations, and then the climate interpretation. If you need a reminder of what those things are, just say it's been a while since you've entered a record. For that, you can go, so I'm back in the top level now of the project drive. There's this very handy sort of dictionary here called definitions for each field in the QC sheet. These are color-coded to match the columns in the QC sheet. So we've got green, yellow, and so forth. And here we have the field name, exactly matching the QC sheet. And then the definition, so what goes into that sheet in quite a lot of detail, particularly for the interpretation metadata, which is the environment interpretation, the climate interpretation, and a non-compulsory field, the dynamical system. Okay, so that's those if you need to refresh yourself on what they mean. But you'll be going through the paper and keeping an eye out for things like, see, I've made a note of the sort of the seasonality. There's a different proxy here, which is winter runoff. This actually here, this is the environment interpretation, all of those things. So if anything catches my eye, sort of where the authors have stated why this particular proxy reflects hydroclimate variability, then I'll highlight it here generally, and then so you can see I've made a note of that in the notes file. And that'll just make it really easy when you go to enter the metadata into the QC sheet or the metadata entry sheet. It just makes that a lot easier than going straight from the paper. Okay, so the other big thing you will need to do is to get the data and turn it into a lipid. And so generally that'll be either as like a CSV in the supplementary information, or in many cases it'll be stored on NOAA or some other repository. And so once you've got the data, the easiest way to make a lipid file is to go to this address here, so lipid.net/playground. I was just thinking for a second, and there are sort of other tutorials for this in various places. I won't, step through it now, but this is where you can enter data to make a lipid file. So a few things, you'll have to add the dataset name. Remember, I've said it many times, it will be Elsinore.Kirby.2019. Archive type, you choose from a list. In my case, it will be marine sediment. There are a few things you have to enter at this point, so latitude and longitude, which you'll have got from the paper. And then here is where you will actually enter the data. Okay, so you'll go through these steps to make a lipid file and download that, and then you'll download a file that it'll be called the dataset.Name.LPD, and then that lipid you add to this folder here. Number 4, so this is a folder that is shared by everybody in the project, not just one particular archive, but every single person, which is for in lipid pending LiPDverse. Oh, nice, there's a couple here. And so here are a couple of links that Janine has added. But yeah, so you would add your lipid here. So she's using this folder structure, and here is the lipid file. And so once enough lipids accumulate here, to sort of 20 or so, then Nick McKay will come in, do a database update, which means all new lipids that have piled up here will be ingested into the database, which means they'll actually appear on the master QC sheet. And you can see here in this folder 5, added to LiPDverse. These are all of the new data sets actually that have been added to the database so far by project members. And I think all of these were actually added in the last update. I think these are all lakes. So hopefully there'll be some more archive types in there soon. So what have we done so far? We've checked nobody else is working on the record, we've made a notes file, we've started collecting metadata in the notes file, we've got the data and turned it into a lipid, we've added that lipid to folder 4 here, maybe some time has passed, and Nick has added that new data set and all its variables to the database, so that folder has wound up here. At that point, your new data set will appear, it'll actually be at the bottom of the master QC sheet. So will it be at the bottom? No, it won't, because they're alphabetically ordered. Well, it will appear where it wasn't previously. And from there, the last thing that remains is to go ahead and enter your metadata. So again, I'll show you Elsinore because that's a good example. So maybe this has just appeared. A small amount of metadata would have come with it. So anything that you entered as you were making the lipid file appears here. So the latitude and longitude will appear because you have to enter those when you're making the lipid file. The dataset name will be there, the archive, anything else you added at that time. But otherwise, most of the rest of this, so I've highlighted the 3 variables in this dataset, will all be empty. And so you can go ahead and fill them in. So here in purple, so yeah, all of this in green, that's what we call dataset level metadata. So this is a lake sediment core that in this case has 3 different proxies. So we call each of those a different variable, but all from the same data set. If what I just said confuses you, there I have made many materials to explain the difference between a data set and a variable. I think I'm going to have a post up on our Substack about that, but also there's this doc lipid and QC sheet tips. And here I've got in very clear terms what a data set is versus a variable, and some examples of that in the QC sheet. So just have a look if you're not quite sure still what a data set versus a variable is. Anyway, so here's Elsinore, which, in our little example we've just added. So it's one data set with 3 variables. In green here is the data set level metadata. Now in purple, we have some information about the variable. So in this case, I've got the delta 13C and the delta 18 of bulk sediment, and also grain size in this particular case. And then as we go on, we get to now we're getting to the interpretation metadata. Now you can see here, interestingly, that I've only entered interpretation metadata for 2 of these variables, for delta 18 and sand. I have not entered in any interpretation metadata for delta 13C. And that is because in this paper, the authors state explicitly that both the grain size of the sand and the delta 18 reflect some aspect of hydroclimate variability, but they do not do the same for delta 13C. So actually this variable of a data set does not pass our criteria for inclusion because it's not primarily hydroclimate related, but these second 2 variables do. And that is fine. We have a way to deal with that because it's a very common scenario, particularly in multi-proxy single archive data sets. So, lakes, marine sediments, tree cores, you name it. We don't like to, we try to not muck around with the author's data. So if they've published 18 variables, we should include all 18 variables in the lipid. There's various reasons for that, but you can probably think of them. But the way we deal with that is with my favorite field in the database, which is all the way at the end here in orange. It's called in this compilation. In this compilation. And what in this compilation means is this variable officially a part of the Hydroclimate2k database? So this means that there can be a variable included in a lipid, but that is not considered part of our database. And you can see here for delta 13C, I flagged it as false. But for the other 2 variables, I've added true. And actually in this column, a blank space is equivalent to false. So just remember that if you're thinking of also going through and assessing some of these records these are records that were inherited from existing databases, until someone has gone through and checked whether or not they pass our criteria for inclusion, this blank space here is equivalent to false. But there we go. So, and if a variable of a data set is not hydroclimate related, it's not part of our compilation, you do not have to enter the interpretation metadata. You can just ignore it. The only thing you'll do is put it in the lipid, and from there you don't have to think about it again. Okay, but we have 2 variables here that are hydroclimate related, and you can see I've added the environment interpretation, the relationship of that with, if the proxy value increases, does the environment variable increase or decrease, the seasonality. This is a free text field describing the basis for the interpretation. Then I've also got the climate variable, and I think even for this one, the dynamical system. Okay, and so the final thing I need to say here, which is very important, is that this sheet that you are looking at, the master QC sheet, which we could also call the metadata entry sheet, what happens in this sheet happens to the database. So, when you make a change to this sheet, that change is reflected next time the database is updated. So just say, for some reason you accidentally changed archive type from lake sediment to coral here. If you forgot to fix that, then the next time the database is updated, this would officially be flagged a coral, and that can cause all sorts of problems. So the reason I'm saying this is to just be a little bit careful when you're in here. So it's things like making sure you're always editing the right row. I mean, you might be typing along here and accidentally end up down here, just those sorts of things. And the last tip I will give you for working with the Master QC sheet, I'm actually going to do a post or a video specifically on this later, but just imagine a case where lots and lots of people are working in this sheet at once. It's bouncing around. That could get very annoying. Say, you just wanted to be looking at lakes for some reason, and in fact, you just wanted to be really careful and only filter for, Elsinore. Because doing stuff like this can make it a lot easier for you. But if you just apply a filter like this without taking a step, which I'll show you in a second, this filter view will be applied to everybody. So some poor person from the tree or documentary team would come in and be like, oh my gosh, like, where's all my data? Oh. So there is a way around this, fortunately. Select all, I'm just going to make it back to normal. Okay, and that is in something called a filter view. And so you can create these things called filter views. And when you enter a filter view, then any filtering that you do on your screen is personal to you. It doesn't affect how somebody else sees this particular sheet. And so so this is one I've made earlier. I call it lake sediment. I mean, anyone, I should probably call it Georgie's view or something like that. And now you can see this has appeared. So I'm in this view called lake sediment. And now if I do any further filtering, like just Fairbaker Lake, then I'm changing the view only for myself. I'm not altering what other people see. And so this is really, and every time you're in the Master QC sheet, it would be best if you're working in a filter view like this, just so you're not affecting how other people see the QC sheet. And then when you want to, leave it, if you want to leave it for some reason, you can just go back to data, change view and exit view, and we'll go back to just the regular old QC sheet. Okay, so I think that is everything, all of the steps. The last thing I forgot to say is once, so you've got that notes file. If you're following the sort of formal workflow that the Lake team are using, you'll also sort of be moving that folder through various official steps. Don't worry about it too much. That's the sort of detail that your archive leaders can show you. But it can be handy to make a note somewhere. So like if you have a workflow overview type sheet of if you have, what stage a data set you're assessing is up to. You're waiting to get data from the authors, because that can be sometimes, it can take a while. Or are you busy accumulating metadata, or is that data set now officially, it's fully metadata and all sorted. That just helps, everyone in your team to keep track of what's happening with each data set. Cool. All right. Hope that helps.